The Bob Murphy Show, episode 80. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Bob Murphy Show. Once again, I am going to be replaying for you an interview I did on a separate podcast because I think the content was so interesting and relatively unique. So I was asked by Patrick to be on his show, which they call Cave to the Cross Apologetics. And so it's normally hosted by two guys, Patrick and Tony. Let me just read a little bit from their website so you have an idea what this podcast is normally about. Patrick and Tony have been friends since 2005 and have met regularly since 2012 for book discussion. A continuous study of presuppositional apologetics began during that first meeting and hasn't really stopped. Together they have read books from those in the Christian apologetic camp, atheists writing against the faith, and various philosophers. Now, Tony, who's the older gentleman, has graduate degrees from Western Michigan University and Grand Rapids Theology Seminary. He earned his PhD in the philosophy of science from Michigan State University. And Patrick has a bachelor's of science from Western Michigan University, where he minored in philosophy. And he says he's been mentored by Tony since 2005, during which time his interest in philosophy and apologetics grew. And so on this particular interview, though, it's just going to be Tony talking to me it's going to be Patrick talking to me. Tony couldn't make it. And Patrick is also a big fan of Austrian economics and libertarianism. And so we'll see the interaction of those. And in particular, that phrase presuppositional apologetics, Patrick thinks that has overlap with Mises' approach to praxeology, right? Founding on the action axiom and the method of how do we deduce economic laws rather than the empirical method that is so popular among mainstream economists, or at least when you ask them how do you do economics, that's what they'll say, even if in practice they probably do follow more the Misesian model. In any event, I think it was a really interesting discussion. Like I said, even when I've been interviewed by other Christians about economic stuff, we didn't get into some of these topics. The one that if you've seen the headline for how I tried to do clickbait on this was the issue of suppose Adam and Eve hadn't been banished from the Garden of Eden, would the laws of economics have still been true? Okay, and I was like, wow, that's a deep question, and so I give the answer. My particular answer is not, in other words, the yes or no, I don't think is really the issue. I think it's just seeing how did I try to scope out the answer. I think that's what might be instructive to some of you. So without further ado, here is my discussion with Patrick, a co-host on the Cave to the Cross Apologetics podcast.
Hello, everyone. I'm Patrick, and this is Cave to the Cross Apologetics. And no Tony today, which is fine because if he was here, I'd probably step over him just to get more questions in from our guests. I'm a really big fan of our guest, and it's probably best that he's not here. So let me introduce Robert Murphy. Dr. Murphy is a research assistant professor at the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University. He's also senior economist at the Institute for Energy Research, a research fellow with the Independent Institute, an associate scholar senior fellow with the Mises Institute, and a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute in Canada. His current research focuses on economics of climate change, which he's also testified in front of Congress with, as well as the impact of minimum wages. He's earned his BA in economics from Hillsdale College, so once again, we have a tie-in to the great state of Michigan. And his PhD in economics is from New York University. He has authored numerous scholarly articles in energy policy studies, over 100 popular publications for lay audiences, and multiple books including Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism, The Great Depression, The New Deal, The Primal Prescription, Contra Krugman, Smashing the Errors of America's Most Famous Keynesian, his newest one, and two of my absolute favorite books just in general, Choice, Cooperation, Enterprise, and Human Action, which he's taken Mises's tome and distilled it down to people that can read it like me. And a textbook for junior high students, which I'm currently reading, Lessons for the Young Economist, which is available for free from the Mises Institute. And if you ever want to read Murray Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State, get Dr. Murphy's study guide, because I always say it's like reading A Clockwork Orange. There's this like made up language in it, and so if you kind of put the book down and you walk away from it, you completely forget what that type of language is. So you have to get rolling again. And so Rothbard's pretty much the exact same. As you really just need something to go back and kind of test you on what you make sure you know. So he also hosts 3 podcasts, including Contra Krugman, The Laura Murphy Show, and the aptly named The Bob Murphy Show. So Dr. Murphy, again, thank you for joining us here.
Thanks for having me, Patrick. Glad to do it.
Yeah. The first question is pretty much just for me. And so I can imagine what it's like to be Brad Pitt, in the sense that how famous he is, probably just, leaps and bounds what I probably can imagine. How is it for you being the Brad Pitt of economists, for at least me?
In what, I mean, so I appreciate
I mean, you
that.
you emailed me before this saying that you're riding a train. I'm assuming if I'm on that train, I am just deluging you with handshakes and attaboys and just.
So it had, I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but it is, I mean, so obviously, like if I go to a libertarian conference or something, people there know me. There was one funny time I was at an economics conference, and I was going down the escalator, and other people were going up. It was a big conference. It was like in DC or something. So there were hundreds of economists there. And I heard this one kid, like they didn't know that I could hear him. And one kid goes to they were younger, so I'm calling them kid. They were probably like 22 or something. And one goes, "Hey, look, that's Bob Murphy." And his buddy goes, "Who's Bob Murphy?" So I think that's pretty good. If this is the kind of thing, when I came out here to Chicago, when I was coming to look for an apartment, I was on the subway or the L train, they call it. And somebody came up to me and he said, "Hey, you look like this guy." And he held up my Wikipedia entry like on his phone, and it was in a sort of picture of me.
Yeah.
And because though he didn't say like, "Hey Bob, it's I'm a fan," or so, he just said, "You look like this guy," and held it up. I was playing it cool. Like I thought the kid was, he did it funny, so I was just playing back with him, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I do."
Yeah.
And that's all. And I didn't like break character, right? And I was just real dry. And then he just got quiet and turned away, and he didn't say
come
anything.
on.
And so then I was worried, like, what the heck? And so I was trying to think of what to say, and I didn't want to say, "Are you a fan?" because that just seems so narcissistic. I said, "Oh, do you listen to the podcast?" I came up with something neutral.
Yeah.
And he went, yeah. And then what turned out that the reason he reacted like that to me, instead of saying like, "Oh, hey, listen to your stuff," or what, is because he said he had done that to someone else 6 months earlier. But it wasn't me. He had gone up and erroneously said to someone, "Hey, you're Bob Murphy," and the guy was like, "Oh." So apparently this kid's got a lot of false positives. But
that's great. Well, yeah, I'm just a huge fan, and I remember you and your co-host for both the Contra Krugman, Tom Woods, for those who might not know, we're talking about how no one really knows references The Simpsons or Seinfeld anymore. And so my reference that no one will get anymore is that this summer has been the summer of Bob Murphy for me, because I've been reading Choice for the second time. You just came out with Contra Krugman, so I had, of course, have it both in the ebook form and have Tom Woods read it to me. And then also I'm reading your Lessons from the Young Economist, and I actually have a physical copy of it because I've come to realize just how integral economics is, and I want to teach it to my daughters, and I wanted your textbook pretty much for them in the future. So this has been my summer of Bob. So,
and I should mention, just in case anyone does look at that. Yeah, for that Lessons for the Young Economist, that is supposed to be like a textbook, and that's one where I think you really ought to have the big physical book as opposed to just trying to look at the PDF.
Yeah, but it's amazing that you and the Mises Institute have put it out there for free. It really is. I'm reading both Choice again. This is my second time because that was the very first thing I read of yours, and then Lessons for the Young Economist. So I always forget which one's which, because I mean they're both covering the same items, which is neat because I'm making sure that I'm staying ahead in Choice, so that way when I come to Young Economist, if there's something I don't get, then I don't feel as bad, and I just read it again. So one of my goals on here was to have you on because I believe there's a kind of a hole within Christian circles, and I believe that Christianity there's no ground that God doesn't touch. And so that's one of the point of this podcast, is to say, hey, there's a lot of philosophy books out there that people are scared of, because if you hear philosophy, you think, oh, there's people with beards and polyester and tweed and what have you, and they're sitting on high and they're using words like, oughts and is, and, they're telling you that nothing is something. I'm saying no, that there's a lot of good stuff within these books where, you might think, oh, well, that's for somebody else. I need it really dumbed down. And so we're offering this podcast as a way to kind of have a book study, if you will, and say, let those two people do the heavy lifting because they read it and distill it down. And I feel that economics is one of those ones where other than a few points, there's R.C. Sproul Jr. has a book, and a few other people that have written about economics, but it seems to be more, in general statements. And I know that you are a full-fledged, a Protestant Christian, and your Christianity comes out within your writing, and so I appreciate that about you. In fact, the first time I emailed you, I heard about Dave Smith, the comic Dave Smith, who at the time was an atheist before he was a deist or whatever he is now, and he was giving you high praise as a Christian who was anti-war and had always been anti-war and made good points as far as utilizing your Christian worldview to bolster up the fact that you were anti-war. It wasn't so much that it flowed out of your desire and then you filled in your Christianity to say, here's kind of the God of the gaps. The way that you live your life is as a Christian, and your podcast has that as well, as you're a Christian and an economist. And I think through living out your life in your work as well, you are proclaiming God's glory because of the truth that you're representing there. So I know that's a big intro there, but that's one of the reasons why I want to have you on, because I feel like that there's this kind of missing link between Christians and writing in non-theological areas like economics.
Oh, I mean, I obviously appreciate those words very much. And it's funny you say that because, I'm working on an episode of my podcast where I'm collecting more examples where I think I'm going to be kind of try to be funny about it. And like the title will be something like, libertarians, y'all need Jesus or something like that, because just to show, in certain areas where, and even Dave Smith recently, he had an episode, he was talking with his, sidekick Robbie, and things about like the ethics of, and he was making an analogy with the Matrix and how in the Matrix, they say in the movie that, oh, we're trying to rescue all these people, but until you get red pilled, you're actually the enemy.
Right.
And, and so of course, the movie, The Matrix, that means you can kill those people. I mean, Neo and they go around Trinity, they waste a lot of people, not just the agents. And so, of course, I don't think that's correct. So anyway, just things like that where, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I made that point on our podcast recently because we were talking about ethics and the fact that if you believe that we're in a simulation, does morality still exist there, and can you ground it? And if all people are just these people that are getting in the way, don't we have to address the fact that they are living people who aren't machines? If we're trying to bifurcate humanity versus the machines, it seems odd that they just say, well, they're in your way. So your example is perfect because we talked about that just recently as well.
Yeah. So just to not mislead your listeners who didn't hear that, so I would have to go review it, of course, before I put it in my thing, but it wasn't that Dave said, so therefore anyone who's not a libertarian, you can get, but I mean, it did, leave open the idea of, in other words, I think there's a lot of libertarians who they pull away from it because I think their common sense or their basic morality kicks in and they realize, but some of their arguments would mean technically if you see someone with a Hillary bumper sticker, strictly speaking, oh, they're aggressors and you can do whatever you know what I mean? And,
right.
And I don't think that's correct. And so there's lots of areas like that where libertarian theory only takes you so far. And then you say, oh, what's left? And it's like, well, as a Christian, I know, I have something that's more fundamental, and it's easy to answer those questions and you're not floundering around. Whereas if all you were really sure of was the non-aggression principle, that actually doesn't get you that far.
Right. And I do want to talk about how kind of politics, I think, has kind of infected the church a little bit as we get down here. But I want to start out by asking kind of a few basic questions for you. Recently, in one of his Ask Doug podcast videos, Pastor Doug Wilson recently said that there needs to be a Christian take on free market economics, especially from the Austrian or Chicago school. And that kind of piqued my interest a bit. And as I was reading Lessons for the Young Economist on page 2, don't worry, I'm farther along than page 2, but you wrote, the ability to think like an economist is a crucial component for your education. Only with sound economic thinking will you be able to make sense of how the world works, to make responsible decisions regarding grand political ideas, as well as your occupation and mundane household finances. You must first decide to learn basic economics. So just in general, what is economics and why should we as Christians even care about it?
Okay, great question. So I think, it's thinking like an economist. So this isn't something that I would put like in terms of I would think longer and harder about it, and probably the way I motivate it in the textbook chapters is more eloquent. But the way of sort of thinking rationally through consequences and understanding the role of incentives and different institutional structures, and just how, in particular, property rights are used and the consequences of using them, and just seeing how people interact in solving the problem of material scarcity. And so I think there's a large area of human interaction. And I guess, see, it's not that, I mean, so economics certainly includes money, but it's more than just that. It's not just commercial transactions.
Yeah.
And so I think did I have it? No, I think I had it in Choice, where I went through and I quoted from a bunch of different economists. It's a tricky subject when you ask, like, you look at different economics books, and you, like in the beginning, like to say, how are we going to delimit what our field of inquiry is? And, they actually, but it's basically rational choice, I think is the substance of what economics is. And that's why Ludwig von Mises titled his magnum opus Human Action. Okay, so when you say like what's action, he means as opposed to like reflexive behavior. So when human beings make decisions and we're interpreting them as, they're trying to accomplish some goal, that's purposeful behavior, or what Mises would just call as action. So he doesn't use the word rational, because to him that's redundant, that by action it means you're using your reason to try to achieve an end. And so that's what the rationals, or the scientific study, that's what's called praxeology in Mises' terminology. So that's largely what economics is. So that includes narrowly commercial things, but in general, when people, I would say, like, you could say think strategically, but I think that might be misleading to people. They might think it's just talking about games or some sort of, a certain type of interaction. But in general, when people use means to achieve ends, that's the scope of what economics focuses on. And then when you put those types of activities in the institutional context of having private property and money, then that's what most people think of. Oh yeah, that's economics.
Yeah.
And so the reason, why I study that, I mean, just as there's all sorts of other, like, that's clearly not what physics is, right? And so should Christians be familiar with physics? I think so, just to understand there's apparent rules that govern the material universe, or energy and matter. And it's interesting to study that, just to, one thing, understand God's creation, but also just help you make sense of the world. Mm-hmm. And likewise, there are patterns or rules, if you will, that emerge when you study that sort of purposeful behavior, and particularly when you put it in the context of private property and money, and that's what economics is. So I think that's a wide open area that is rich for human inquiry. And in terms of just seeing it's like, so now, my Christian perspective on it is that it's an amazing thing where God designed the order such that even when people are acting in selfish ways, they unwittingly end up promoting what's called the general welfare. Maybe a little sloppy in terminology. And so, I mean, that's, this is standard stuff like, Joseph and his brothers, what you intended for evil, God, used for good.
Yeah.
So I think you see that shining through. And of course, the obvious reference here is Adam Smith's invisible hand. And let me just say this before I forget. What's funny is one of the papers I want to write is just to document when this misquotation came into vogue. But nowadays, if you ask a regular economist, hey, what did Adam Smith say? He'll say, oh yeah, people act as if guided by an invisible hand.
Right.
But in the original thing, Smith didn't say as if.
Mm-hmm.
He just said they're guided by an invisible hand.
Right. So you believe that it was God's hand that he's talking about there?
I think so, or I
Yeah.
suspect so. I would want to investigate more, but for sure, the actual, I have not found Adam Smith ever saying "as if." That was introduced later by economists, and then that got, so I grew up thinking the quote was "as if," and then once I looked it up, and I was like, oh, wait a minute, no, it isn't.
Yeah, I believe that the Christian Libertarian Institute podcast recently did a really good kind of breakdown of Adam Smith, and in there, I saw kind of his Christianity informing his understanding of the wealth of nations writing, because he's talking about how people when we have kind of this free market system, we are using people's fallen nature in order to get them to produce a benefit to mankind. So by acting selfishly, not selflessly, selfishly, uh, we're turning potential warlords who, 200, 300 years ago would have gained power through their might, and are making that, or allowing them to put that energy into producing goods for people and saying, haha, now I've turned a profit. Oh, good. I mean, everyone benefits from that. And so I think he's talking about man's fallen nature when he talks about their selfish kind of normal attitude.
Yeah, I agree with all that. Also, too, just to give more of a better answer, or fuller answer to your original question, as a Christian, too, just studying economics, I think, in particularly the strand of it that you could call free market economics, for lack of a better term, I think it shows, let me put it this way, a lot of the stuff that Jesus teaches, like on the Sermon on the Mount or something, it sounds crazy, right? And like the world says, no, that couldn't possibly work. That's a suicide strategy if you were to do that. And so you see echoes of that sort of, incredulity in political issues too. Like, oh, are you kidding me? Like you can't, like if you went back into the Middle Ages and there was like the system of, people having different occupations just spelled out for them with guilds and so on. And you said, no, how about just anybody who wants to become a cobbler can become a cobbler. It's not that your dad has to have done that and train you and raise you, or you have to go find an existing master to train. Just, you want to be a farmer, go be a farmer. You want to be a painter, go do that. You want to be a carpenter, go ahead and just let anyone be what they want. And no one can force you to pick an occupation. The average person would have said that's crazy, because what if everyone chooses to be a farmer? Then there's not going to be any carpenters. What if nobody decides to be a farmer? We're going to starve to death. That's nutty. And if you sat there and tried to say, oh, no, don't worry, wages would adjust, and that would give the feedback, that would sound stupid. That's like a very risky thing, to say the least. And they would probably tell you quite, we have experience here. We clearly know that your system of free labor choice wouldn't possibly work.
Yeah.
And so so that things like that in general. So, me coming more and more, there was a period of atheism in my life, but I was still a free market economist at that stretch. So I'm saying that having that in my back pocket, like that, I think helped open up my mind to see the possibilities that, just because, or the things Jesus teaches, even though that sounds like, oh, that couldn't possibly work, that no, you're being too cynical and jaded. If more and more people actually did this and listened to them, you just watch what would happen. You'll be amazed.
Yeah. Yeah. I liked one of your kind of more recent episodes too on the immorality of slavery. And not so much that, owning people is wrong, because, we even as Christians, we can make that argument. But you talked about how putting slaves in this kind of forced perspective doesn't allow them to kind of reap benefits from their own free will produced labor. It doesn't allow for them to want to, develop new technologies that they might, where if you give them an incentive to kind of reap the benefit either through, profit sharing, or the ability to just break apart on your own and only produce, iPhones in the 1920s, it would have given them the ability to do that. And I thought that was just a really great take on, yes, we can talk about the immorality of slavery. And it's interesting to see how Paul doesn't really address that when he's talking to Philemon. He talks about, love your brother as a fellow Christian. And then if you do that, you kind of get also added benefits. And one of those, I think Paul kind of sees where that's going to go, where if Christianity does take hold, which I think he believes he's going to, then the entire Roman world falls apart, it just in its labor,
Mhm.
for its servanthood. And it eventually did, because one of the driving factors was, well, if you're just using free labor, who's hiring the free Romans to come in and do anything? Well, no one. So then you're going to have, a problem just from free people not having work. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, appreciate that. And what's funny there too is just to help your listeners who aren't familiar with that line of argument. There's a whole group of historians and social scientists more generally who are arguing that U.S. capitalism benefited greatly, from the existence of slavery.
Right.
And so the reason they're doing that, they would say, well, we're documenting historical things and we're spreading the truth with our scholarship. But I'm saying, to what end, what political goal is that serving? Is they want there to be a stain on capital. They don't like capitalism. And so they can't deny that, oh yeah, the U.S. produces more stuff than the Soviet Union did, or that communist Cuba did, or North Korea. But we want to taint it somehow and say, okay, but it's guilty because it has this original sin of slavery. And so partly what I was pointing out in my work is, okay, but look at what you're doing. You're actually teaching people, if you just set aside the immorality of it, the way to prosperity is to enslave a fraction of your population. And are you sure you want to be teaching people that? Like,
Right.
let's make sure that that's actually true.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of funny when I'm going around saying, no, actually the U.S. was poorer in 1850 because of the existence of slavery. Had they freed slaves, in the year 1800, the U.S. would have been even richer in the year, 1910 than it was otherwise. And so it's not true that U.S. prosperity nowadays can ultimately be tied to the benefits of slavery, putting aside the horrendous immorality of it. No, we're poorer now than we otherwise would have been, right? And yet that shocks a lot of people, and they get real defensive when it's like, no, especially for those whose careers are, for academics who spend more time denouncing slavery than I do, it's funny that actually their dog in the fight is to say slavery is a very productive system.
Right.
That's kind of perverse when you think about it.
Yeah. So we should all go back to that in case, we become too populist or something. And I think I think it's interesting. Maybe it's a correlation causation thing,
Mhm.
where you have the Industrial Revolution occurring pretty much right after Reconstruction finally, anyone can make a for better or for worse argument there. But, once kind of the idea that Lincoln had of what it wanted to do to the South, you have this big boom, and it's kind of a worldwide thing, because you've gotten away from war, especially in America. You've got the ability to compete still within states' rights at the time, before Wilson and Roosevelt come about, and so I think that there's not the Industrial Revolution happened when it did, just because I think there was the ability for people to understand owned property way more, and people to be free to do more what they want.
Right. And I'm not enough of a historian. You're right. I mean, clearly those two things go hand in hand. And the question is just which caused which. The other possibility is that it was the ideas of classical liberalism and so forth, the idea of like limited government and so forth, and people should be able to choose their occupation. That once that started, then you had experiments in that spelled the doom of slavery. As more and more people became free laborers and so on.
Yeah. Okay. I'm kind of are all over with the questions here. So if I divert too much, let me know. Are economic principles then derived from nature and are universally true, or do they change over time? So I think I hate to get so personal back into my take, but the only thing I learned from my high school economics was basic econ was I don't want to be a teacher because I don't want to become like my basic econ teacher, and something about supply and demand. And I understood the supply and demand graph, and that's pretty much all I got from it. And unfortunately, once I owned a house, that's when I understood from people like you and Mises and Rothbard and the whole slew of the Institute guys, how important economics is. Then in this show, when we talk about universal truths, are they for lack of a better term, are they derived from God? Does God instill them into place from either his nature or just how he's made the universe? Or is it something that arises out of humanity's kind of fallen nature?
Wow, that's a great question. Okay.
I do have to say, one of my most crowning achievements with Twitter was asking you a Twitter question was, if the fall never happened, would current economic principles be true? And you said that it won the day. So I have that like framed in my room. So
what did I say? I said that's the question of the day.
yeah. I think
Okay.
it was probably something like to divert away from everyone talking about, I don't know, Trump or somebody. And so we're like, well, let's have a discussion on what's really good economic questions. And so that was my questions.
Okay, great. Okay, so with the caveat that it's possible I'm going to say something and dig myself into a hole, and then later say, "Wait a minute, I misspoke."
Feel free to use it on your podcast. So it's
sure.
It's all right.
Yeah, no, this is good stuff. Okay. In terms of just the basic logic of choice, let's call it, or what Mises would call praxeology, the fact that people have they have goals, subjective goals, and they use their reason. They pick means to try to achieve them. And so here, there's no assumption of being correct. Like and make sure your listeners get the distinction I'm getting at here. If you see, if you throw a rock up in the air, it goes in a certain trajectory. We just don't say, oh, at first the rock wanted to go towards the sun and then it changed its mind and went towards the ground. That's just not the way we don't attribute motivation and desires to inanimate things. Mm-hmm. That's not the way we talk nowadays. Whereas if you do see someone, driving her car and she's going, towards the store and then does a U-turn and comes back, it's perfectly, quote, scientific to say, oh, she thought she needed to go to the store and then she realized she forgot her wallet and turned around. I mean, that's not unscientific to talk like that. To assume that human beings have desires and choose means to try to achieve them. So you can actually derive a lot just from that type of decision, let's say, like the stance you take as an analyst to say we're going to attribute intentionality and subjective goals to these blobs of cells, whereas a chemist could look at your body just a collection of atoms or something like that, or a physicist could, and the constituents of your body in terms of matter presumably obey the laws of physics, right? And so they could just look at you like that, but that's not the way we look at you as an economist.
Right.
And so a lot of those first principles are actually, there's not really anything empirical or testing about it. So for example, I can spin out a lot of the bullet points that would be covered in an introductory chapter of an economics book, like How to Think Like an Economist, you alluded to earlier. A lot of those, or I would say all of those principles, they're not really empirical. So things like to say every choice carries a trade-off, or every decision has an opportunity cost, or to say people respond to incentives. Those they're not mere tautologies. It's not that I'm saying a bachelor is an unmarried male, which is really just a definition. It seems like I'm saying something about reality with those earlier expressions, and yet if I say okay, every choice has a trade-off, how would you test that? You know what I mean? Like, would you go and say, oh, we went and we looked at 1,000 choices, and in every single one there was a trade-off. So far, so good. You'd realize, well, no, you're missing the point. Like, just by the nature of it, if I'm deciding to view what you did as a choice, then necessarily there must be a trade-off because there was a second best thing you could have done, and the value to you of that is what we call the opportunity cost. Okay, so it kind of, the fact that there was an opportunity cost in your decision flows from the fact that I decided to call that a decision. Whereas, if someone just flings hot oil on you and you flinch, you didn't really choose to do that. That's just an involuntary bodily reaction. So that's the distinction we're making.
Right.
And so all those standard principles, and even like supply and demand curves in analysis, I can build all that up. Now, and so the issue is, so economics as a science would exist regardless of the condition of man, let's say, so long as people had choices and subjective goals and it had reason. But I suppose a thing probably a lot of economists would say is that in the Garden of Eden there wasn't scarcity, at least the way we think of it now. Mm-hmm. And so it's possible that it wouldn't have been useful to elaborate economics. That you wouldn't have needed it for anything. So it wouldn't have been false, but it wouldn't have been very useful. So I don't know if that's the way to get it. And also, let me just mention, some people do push it even further. I don't know if Mises, certainly Austrians, I can't remember who said this, but we're saying even in the Garden of Eden, there would still be the flux of time. I think probably it was Mises that talks like this. And so even if, you weren't ever worried about going hungry, still at any given moment, you could only be doing one thing, or, one subset of things that you could do simultaneously. And so you'd still have to order your day. You'd still have to come up with, what am I going to do right now? What am I going to do next hour? If time still passed. And so in that sense, there would still be some type of scarcity because you couldn't do everything all at once, the flow of time. And so then even there, economics would still apply to your decision on how to order your activities. So that's kind of let me put it this way. There have been attempts to apply economic reasoning to unconventional areas, things like, choosing a mate, or other areas, or the economics of crime. In some of those areas, I just think it's kind of goofy, or it gives me the creeps, even in some places.
Like in Freakonomics, where it talks about it's good that we had abortions because low income people tend to cause more crimes. Therefore, we saw a decrease in crime because of more abortions. But
I mean, so yes, that gives me the creeps. And also, I think it was what's his name, John Lott, I think, came up with some statistic. It might have been somebody else. Maybe John Lott just cited it. I think actually, what's that guy's name? Is it Levitt? I think his numbers don't hold up. Like, his story doesn't work. Because if you look at like the demographics of, the age of when the crime rate should have started dropping in terms of what segment of the population, it doesn't fit the story about Roe v. Wade and everything. But so, yes, I agree with you. That gives me the creeps too. And that's an economist trying to do something outside the norm. But that's not even what I mean. I mean stuff like, to say, there's the marriage market, and as the supply of, income earning females rises, that means such and such. And therefore, that kind of stuff, sometimes it gives me the creeps. And,
like holding off on gold value, like, hold on to your gold or your singleness now, because women prices will be more valuable in the future.
Right. Yeah, that kind of talk. And I get it there, and I'm stumbling here. I'm trying to come up with, but I mean, you could apply it. You could say, the supply of, friends entering the playground has gone up, and so therefore, the price of being a friend has gone down, or that kind of stuff. And so maybe we would expect kids to, to be meaner to each other, or whatever. I'm making stuff up here, but I'm saying in certain things, and I don't just, and I want to be clear, I don't just mean, it makes me queasy, and so I find it. I'm saying like the standard like supply and demand analysis, because what it does is it's saying other things equal, okay, and so it's
right.
Like, for example, you could say, if you want your wife to be nicer to you, you should just increase the amount you pay her, so that when you come home at night, if you really, you start giving her $20 every time she says, hello, dear. And technically that there's nothing wrong with that, but it's, it says other things equal. And so maybe one of the other things that's not equal now is that it's weird if you're trying to give your money to your wife to say hello to you. You know what I'm saying? So right. It's not that it's wrong, but that analysis in some situations, in some settings, I think is totally beside the point, and it's counterproductive. So that's, to your original question. Yeah. I think there are things that just our nature as beings who have reason in subjective goals. So we're individuals, which is what that would come from. Maybe it wouldn't work to try to use economics to explain a beehive if, the individuals don't have different goals, really. They just all work together to do whatever's in the interest of, the hive or something. Given that people are unique individuals with possibly different goals or motivations, and they have reason, then I think you can spin out the basic structure of the science of economics. But if it's before the fall, there might not be much point in doing so. It might not be that useful for anything.
So that might be something a economic theology person would write their dissertation on.
Yeah,
there you go. we're helping people out already, I'm telling you. Nobel Prize-winning economist James Buchanan explains what he calls economic odds in his paper, Afraid to be Free. According to Buchanan, the government as savior view can be derived from Keynesian economic thought as expressed when citizens may generally want to extend the parental role of the welfare state to allow the state to replace God. And just to be fair, he doesn't say too many good things about deists as well. But Keynesian economic thought, and you come from the Austrian economic school. I always want to preface what you always preface, because you always do. So I'll tee it up for you. It's not that this derives from only Austria, but that it comes from people from Austria. And so looking at the Wikipedia page for Austrian economics when I was first starting it, it's terrible. I read it and I'm like, this sounds all gobbledygook. So what's the best way that we can describe Austrian economics? And obviously we don't want to replace God with the state as the Keynesians do. So what would be the main kind of differences between Austrian economics, your school, and Keynesian economics? Like that tends to be kind of the most popular one for the past 100 years, 90 years.
Yeah. Okay. So, and this is always tricky too. And if you ask different Austrians, they're going to say different things about, what are the defining attributes of the school. So yes, at the basic level, it's a school of thought, just like there's a Chicago school, a Keynesian school, as you mentioned, and it's called Austrian because Karl Menger, the founder, was from Austria. So originally that was a term of derision because it was like the German historical school economists. This is back in the 1870s.
Back when there was in Austria.
Yeah, right. they were looking down their nose upon Menger and his disciples that were emerging, and so they said, "Oh, that's just Austrian economics. That's a backwater. It's not like here in Germany, which is the center of scholarship." That was where the term came from.
And then World War II happened.
Yeah.
It's amazing too. Just to sidetrack you completely, how much philosophy is lost and how much bad philosophy comes out of Germany during World War II time that we could have quashed. And I'm pretty sure we wouldn't have people writing things like misquoting Jesus because they come from a school of thought that should just be debunked. But because it took so long to come over, it never had the ability to be impacted by other theories. So you just had, Germany coming up with both good and bad ideas during World War II time, and it really needed to be quashed, especially for anything Bart Ehrman does.
Yeah, I mean, it really is amazing. I don't know when to start it, but 1850 to World War I. The intellectual milieu of all the people meeting in, Vienna and in Germany, and just all the thinkers involved and people coming and going in different circles, or even just like Mises' private seminar, when you see the list of who's who and the people that, came in and out of those circles, it's a lot of not just economists, but, other major philosophers and political scientists and so forth.
Yeah.
So yeah, the Austrian school, it's individualistic, and I don't mean politically. I just mean it builds up from the individual as the locus of analysis, and as opposed to if you say, well, what else would it be? I mean, because there are types of economics that just look at big macro variables, like to say, oh, what's the price level? Well, you look at the money supply, you look at the velocity with which dollar bills turn over, and then you can back out, what the price per unit good. That sort of thing, where it's it's looking at the economy just as like a bunch of big numbers, as opposed to individual decisions. And that you could say, oh well, prices, we start with individuals and they want to hold money, and what's the demand for money and that sort of thing. So the Austrian economics certainly is it's called methodological individualism, and the other one's methodological subjectivism. And I know those are big words, but just saying it. They assume individuals are the concrete, the atoms that form the analysis, and that they have subjective goals. So Karl Menger, who was the founder of the Austrian school, in a standard history of economic thought book, would be credited as one of the three people who ushered in what's called the marginal revolution. So that was overturning old classical value theory and replacing it with the new modern subjective value theory. So that's a defining element of Austrian economics because their founder was one of the people that, you know, brought that revolution. And so there, what does that mean? It's just saying when you're trying to explain prices, the ultimate building block or the fundamental building block is the fact that people have subjective preferences. And so ultimately, you know, why is a bottle of wine cost whatever, $50? Why is the price $50? You don't start and say, oh, well, because the grapes were really expensive, and so the bottle of wine has to cost that much. Otherwise, the producer wouldn't, you know, be able to cover his cost. That, you know, nowadays, the way the economists think, that causality is backwards. It's that the final goods that consumers buy is because they have utility for the consumer in the eye of the beholder. And then that works its way backwards. And that's why people are willing to pay for grapes, because they can be used to make the wine. Okay, so that type of thinking, that's something that Carl Menger helped usher in. And then, I mean, one of the things, the reason I think it's important nowadays for people to know about the Austrian school, this guy Ludwig von Mises, he developed a theory of the business cycle that other schools of thought can't yield, because the Austrian school has what's called an emphasis on capital structure. So just real briefly, I realize I'm throwing out some big buzzwords here, but in the Austrian tradition, they pay a lot of attention to the fact that production takes time, and that things go through stages, let's call them. So this is going to be simplistic, but just so your listeners understand where I'm coming from. Like, to get loaves of bread into the grocery store, you know, first they got to plant the wheat, then it's got to go to the next stage to the miller, and then it goes to the baker, and so on. And that type of process, Austrians really take that seriously in their modeling. And in particular, they look at how do interest rates kind of help coordinate the structure of that production process that might, when you're looking at any particular good in its life cycle, as it were, it might take years to develop before the thing that you see, you know, in the store available for purchase. And because the Austrians spend so much time and care developing that understanding of that framework, that's why they can then come in and say, oh, and so if the central bank comes in and artificially manipulates interest rates, say by flooding the market with cheap credit that pushes down interest rates so they're artificially low, then they can see what would happen. Oh, it might cause an unsustainable boom, right? So that kind of explanation or theory, other schools of thought like the Keynesians can't even really develop, because their model doesn't have this capital structure that, you know, unfolds over years. So that it's not that the Austrian story is wrong in that approach. It's like you couldn't even tell that story in a standard Keynesian framework, because the standard Keynesian framework is just it's real macro and aggregated, and there's not enough distinctions or subtlety and detail to allow that sort of story to unfold. So I'm just there. That's not like the definition of the Austrian school, but I'm just explaining that's one of the components of it that I think make it so relevant nowadays, because that's such an important element of our lives right now. Central banks, in my opinion, engaging in very destructive behavior.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I don't know, you know, which hand was shaking what, but with presuppositional apologetics, we have certain axioms that we hold to, and there's not a equation that we put everything in and say, you know, okay, add the Kalam argument plus you know, the resurrection accounts, historicity by, you know, various non-biblical writers, and it all equals out to Christianity is true. We hold the fact that you know, Christianity is true, and then derive certain principles from that. And so with Austrian economics, I see people they act with purpose, whether or not those purposes are right or wrong. You know, that's not the argument, but things like you know, how should we think about when a flood happens and people coming over and selling bottles of water for $500? Well, you know, any person that sees that and goes, oh, that's just immoral. But coming from your perspective, that's a great thing, because then someone else will see that and go, oh, I can sell my bottled water for $400, and someone else can come in and say, oh, I'll undercut them. And so you get a bigger supply into those areas. And so the price will drop as a result of people competing with each other. And I think that's just one of the really awesome things to see is how much your worldview of economics informs it. Because things like with Keynesian economics, it seems like, well, here's 1,000 variables, and I have to either skew my models so that I can deal with those, or I can skew it to say, well, these ones aren't as important. And I just like the fact that you take a kind of a different approach that explains what we see through these kind of axiomatic argumentation that Austrian economics are known for.
Well, yeah, and you're right, and I didn't explicitly mention that, and I probably should have. That, yeah, when you're saying like what's the defining attributes of the Austrian school. So yeah, one of the early battles that Karl Menger had with his counterparts in the German historical school. So it's true that Austrians tend to be free market in terms of their policy prescriptions, but it's not built in. Right. In other words, it's not that they just say at the outset, "Oh yeah, we hate the government" or something like that. Like it does flow, and it's also true in practice that the German historical school, a lot of them were, I would say, apologists, for the Prussian Empire, and so so Menger with his critiques of some certain government intervention policies, that was a problem, and so one of the ways that the German historical school would try to get around that is to say, well, no, you can't. It's not like there's laws of economics. Everything in matter. It's a case by case basis. So here I'm obviously paraphrasing, and they spoke in German, and so whereas Menger was saying, no, there's laws of economics, right? In other words, like a physicist, it's not like, oh, there's one type of physics that applied back in ancient Rome, but then a different physics applied, in modern day democracies. You know what I mean? Like that would be silly talk. And so likewise, Menger thought, no, I'm developing laws of economics. Okay. And whereas the German historical school would have thought more, well, no, what may have worked back in ancient Rome with their system is one thing. And then now what works for us is a different thing. You see what I'm saying? They were trying to deny that there was such a thing as the laws of economics. And so that is one element. And then also, yeah, Mises, and this is one of his more controversial stances, and even not all modern day Austrians, die on this hill, but Mises himself, and certainly like Murray Rothbard and people who are in that tradition of the Austrian school, thought that basic economics was a priori, meaning, yeah, you start fundamentally with the action axiom. If you're going to decide to interpret the behavior you see out in the world as the result of conscious choice, because ultimately you don't know. You can't literally be inside someone else's mind and know that they feel things the way you subjectively know you feel stuff. You just kind of think that makes sense. That's like a hypothesis, if you will. But once you commit to that, then Mises thought all the standard results of economics, he even called them theorems, so that kind of shows he didn't think it was open to empirical verification, flow from that. And, and people derided him as being unscientific and anti-empirical, but likewise, the analogy I use with geometry, that if you're going to learn geometry, is certainly very important. You can't go build a bridge if you don't know anything about geometry. And yet, if you said, oh, here's the Pythagorean theorem, and you teach it to someone, and they say, well, how do we know that's true? Should we go test 1,000 right triangles and make sure it's true? You would say, no, you've missed the point. You don't understand what a proof is. We have these axioms and these rules of transformation. And if you give me the axioms, then I can deduce, the Pythagorean theorem. It's a theorem. I proved it. And you wouldn't go test it. And that's certainly not unscientific to do that. So that's what Mises thought basic economics was. And so, yeah, I guess you're saying it has a certain overlap with a type of apologetics.
Yeah. I want to be respectful of your time, and I've only gone through half the questions that I want to.
I can go till like 45 after if you want.
Yeah, if that's okay for you.
Yeah,
okay,
sure. So like 18 more minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to have you on again and ask you a whole bunch of other questions. So then a couple of things that you mentioned that Austrian economics views as important are both interest rates and you called it central banking. We in America we call it a Federal Reserve System. As Christians, how are we to understand this fractional reserve banking system? And I know that's another term in this fiat money system.
Hey, Patrick, can I?
Yeah.
If you don't mind, can I go back and just say something I meant to say about the like if there's a natural disaster and like bottled water and that thing, because this actually illustrates well what I was trying to say earlier about is a Christian and like why should a Christian know economics.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, so that's a good example. So again, let's say the situation is there's a a flood or a hurricane or something, and the roads are all closed, and so right now, yeah, the local storekeeper, he's only got a few cases of bottled water on the shelves, and he knows he could quote get away with charging $20 a case, or charging $4 a bottle or something like that, something that would normally just cost 10 cents or whatever. And so most people are okay, most Americans at least, are okay with the government just flat out prohibiting that, and so setting up a hotline and say, if you catch anybody trying to price gouge in the wake of this natural disaster, taking advantage of the poor plight of our fellow citizens, you call this hotline and the attorney general will get on that. And so I would argue that, well, no, as a Christian, you shouldn't be in favor of that, because it's, using the threat of violence to get people to do your will. And, someone charging a lot for water, it's not obvious why that should be a criminal offense, right? That, to me, that's unchristian. You're basically stealing from the person. You're saying, no, you have to sell it under these terms, and if you're not willing to sell it under these terms, then we're going to throw you in a cage, or that we're going to take more of your money out of your bank account through the state. To me, that's violating one or two of the 10 commandments. So that can't be a Christian thing to do. And so I think, the obvious objection would be, well, that can't be right, or, because it can't be true, Murphy, that the Christian response is to let storekeepers charge whatever the market will bear, because, that's the consequences are too horrible. And so here's where, the Bible wouldn't necessarily tell you how to think that through. I think the Bible tells you what the moral position is, but you would need the study of economics to know that, this is stuff, of course, you were alluding to, Patrick. No, actually having a really high price for bottled water is exactly what you want to have happen, because that rations the available supply. You don't want it to be the case that the first few people who get to the store after the hurricane hits clean the shelves out. Mm-hmm. Because if you had that, if bottled water is still the same price as it was before the storm, then that's going to happen. The first few people who show up, they're going to buy everything. They're going to put it in their pantry, and then everybody else is going to go thirsty. So that's not good. So instead, if you have a high price, then they say, oh, we really probably just need to get, one case of water, and that'll hold us over until they clear the roads. And so that's a good thing. And then also, yes, with a high price, that's giving it the incentive for people around the country, to go rent big trucks and to fill them up with bottled water and to go ship them into the region to, go get through the flood waters or what have you. Whereas otherwise, they probably wouldn't do that. It wouldn't be worth their while to organize the effort to ship a bunch of bottled water to Houston or wherever the city was that got smacked. Yeah. And so if you think it through, it's, no, actually that high price serves a purpose. And then last but not least, I would say if you're a store owner and you're benefiting from a genuine windfall, meaning, it's not that you, like, let's say you knew the hurricane was coming and you thought, oh, the price might be real high. Let me, in case that happens, just load up on water. And so you end up, bulking up your inventory way beyond what you normally would have on the off chance that the storm hits and then prices go up. Again, you want to reward that activity, right? So it's not just a fact of nature how much bottled water is in the city when the storm hits. If people were farsighted and stocked up, you want to reward that behavior so that the next time a hurricane comes, the crisis isn't as bad. But to the extent that, you're honest with yourself, you're a convenience store owner and the amount of water I had on hand, the bottled water, I didn't bulk up. I just happened to be sitting here. I actually got lucky in the sense, right? The hurricane hit, I didn't die. My store is still open. And instead of me charging $5 for a case, I get to charge $25. That's a pure windfall to me. Okay, you still charge it and then donate that to the Red Cross, right? And so that will ensure, then they can use the money for, needy families or whatever. So the high price still rations the available quantity so that households only take what they really need. But then if you feel guilty, and probably they had a Christian thing to do, so you're not benefiting from others' misfortune, is donate it to some philanthropist or give it to the church or whatever, some organization that you think is using the money responsibly. So that's what I would say. So it's, to me, that's, so again, you see how that knowledge of economics reassures you that, you really shouldn't just be able to stick a gun at somebody and say, because I think most Christians would agree, if a store owner said, no, I'm charging $25 a case, you couldn't just take out a gun and say, give me the water for the pre-crisis price or I'm going to shoot you. I think
send somebody else to do that.
Right. Most Christians, you can't do that. And so I would just argue, okay, but if you're going to have the government have an anti-price gouging law, aren't you kind of doing that through a proxy?
Yeah.
And so I think to the extent that Christians would shy away from my analysis because they, quote, no, it can't be true, or it can't be the right answer to just let them charge whatever the market. I'm trying to show, look at the good social consequence. So you're just wrong when you think the way the world works is that following, the straightforward interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount would lead to disaster. Say, no, actually it wouldn't. You think it would, but you're operating out of fear.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's this a really great movie that I think all Christians should watch called Poverty Inc. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah, it's amazing that when we talk about trade-offs in the Austrian school, how being helpful actually is hurtful at times, where we think, okay, we buy a pair of shoes and someone gives them to poor people in Africa who don't have shoes. Well, what we've accidentally done is taken out all the shoe manufacturers from the corner store cobbler to the Nike of Kenya or whatever it might be, because we're bringing an influx of cheap, sometimes free goods over, and we're destroying markets over there. And so by having a proper understanding of good economic principles, we're less likely to engage in just give poor Africa free things, instead of saying like, okay, well, maybe can make proper short-term loans that allows a business to build capital off the bat, and then build machinery that will then employ more people, that then they can become self-sufficient. And so they're not always hoping that Americans over here for the next 20 years are going to keep buying shoes that then they can have free shoes as well. Once I watched that movie, I thought it was really important to have this kind of proper understanding of Christian ethics and values as it comes to economic principles. And so things like donor C, having kind of that one-on-one correlation of here's a woman who needs a house built, and she has zero capital, and she doesn't have any any industry. If we can give to that person and build that one person to then have a direct influence over one person, then that's a more proper understanding of how we can contribute charitably without destroying economies, really. And shoes is just one aspect of that movie.
Let me just mention, it's funny you bring that up. I'm still grappling with this myself. So and I'm just being honest with you intellectually here, is so clearly stuff like the U.S. government giving aid to the Ethiopian government, and the guy's just withholding food in order to suppress his rival. Clearly, that's bad, right? So, government to government foreign aid, I think, is a disaster, and that's well documented. It's some of the arguments, though, that Poverty Inc., I have to admit, if the argument went through, then some of the other standard arguments that free market people use against tariffs are also in trouble, right? So like a normal argument, like you would see in like Lessons for the Young Economist or whatever, is like an argument, we got to keep high tariff barriers because China is trying to send us real cheap goods, right? And so then we'd say, well, on the limit, what if they send us free goods? Are you telling us we're poor because China sent us free stuff? No, that's good. And so I'm just, it's funny.
No, that's a great point. That's a great point.
So I'm not, but you're right. On the other hand, like, I wouldn't just let my son live in my house until he was 40. You know what I mean? Like I would, not merely because I would be upset, but I think I would be doing him a disservice if I just let him loaf around and didn't kick him out and make him get a job. If I was just giving him handouts, as it were, indefinitely, even though he was able-bodied. And so, yeah, there is something there, and I haven't fully, put my finger on exactly what it is. But yeah, I have to be careful and admit that some of the arguments people in the free market use regarding the Poverty Inc. movie would knock down the arguments they use when it comes to explaining why free trade is the best policy. So there's that.
Yeah. But and
on a Christian podcast, I have to be honest. Otherwise, then
the lightning strikes and we're out. There's so many good questions about things that I don't think when I'm just a normal everyday Christian before I found the school of Robert Murphy. There's so many aspects of the world that I viewed as economics as being either it's the stock market or it's, building your budget. And so there are things like the Federal Reserve and fractional reserve money and fiat money. And I've always heard different people talk about how gold is this really good thing to have, and we should always return back to the gold standard. But there's so many good things that you talk about, that I don't want to just pepper you with questions that are important, but that people should go. Uh, is there any one of those items that you feel that people should know the most about, to either inform their lives or inform kind of how they should look at uh, economic principles within their country?
Oh, okay. I don't know if this is going to sound goofy or not, but I think there is something. So I think a biblical Christian should be aware of the history of the classical gold standard and understand that money, was not created by the state, and that the pieces of paper that the government prints right now, or even electronic tickets, as it were, that's not what money was originally. That the government came in and sort of, pushed out the market's provision and gradually took it over, and then even severed the link to the precious metals, so that we have what's now called state-issued fiat money. I think there is a biblical element there, and among other things, the fact that we print presidents and stuff on there. Jesus saying whose picture is this on the money. I think there's that element as well, the narcissism and deification of these mere men. But I do think there's something there about, like, it used to be called sound money. Mises refers to that. And I think there's something there, like, honest money. Some people might use that phrase. And I think there is something there about, that the money is real and honest. And I know modern economists hearing, especially if they're secular, would roll their eyes and, oh, you fuddy-duddy, with your moralizing. But I really do think there's something there, that the money, when it's produced in a market, is honest and sound, and the government, coming in, or I should say, I want to say the state, because, some people use the term government pretty broadly, could include the family and the church. But this, the political course of state coming in and monopolizing that, and then just running the printing press. I mean, besides the fact that they use it to pay for wars and locking people up and other things that I think are pretty unchristian, but just the nature of what they're doing, like that they're hijack. I mean, I think it's institutionalized theft, among other, it's counterfeiting in a certain sense. And so anyway, I think it's no surprise that a lot of people I know who are really, who track with that line of thinking in terms of they're really against central banking, and so they also happen to be Bible-believing Christians. So there is that overlap. And so the extent that some of your listeners are Christian, but yet they've never really looked into this stuff, I would encourage them to read up on you could get it in my book Choice, for examples, where it'll spell it out. But
yeah,
that's something that's relatively new to me. But in other words, when I was into Mises and Austrian economics when I was younger, I wasn't that big on the commodity money either way. That didn't mean much to me. And I'm saying the older I get, and quote, the wiser I get, hopefully, the more I see, like, wow, in terms of the stuff that the state has done, like, yeah, the military draft is horrible, and the fugitive slave law, and that's horrible. But in terms of just taking over that's a good way of putting it. I think a lot of Christians understand the horror of the state taking over the school system. And I'm saying, yeah, and the state took over money production too, and that's really bad also.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's one of the articles that I really want to write for my blog is I think we get our political viewpoint too much. And I'm only speaking from the points of view that I interact with the most, is Christians tend to say, I can't vote for the Democrats because all they want to do is kill babies. But then they'll take their economic point of view, not from their Christian worldview, but from being a Republican or whatever it might be. And so that's one of the things that I want to encourage people on this podcast, is bringing everything under the central authority of Christ, and saying not what agrees with my Christian worldview, but what from my Christian worldview can I derive principles from. Investment, doing business, like just God telling us to have even scales. And that's not just even scales with other Christians, or in money, it's hold them to a standard that you have balance, and that you have these even scales, and that you don't have your certain idea of, well, this is evil because it's killing babies and that goes against God's will, but then we like it when this other group is in power because they're really ragging on those social justice. Is communism bad? It's because it has the improper view of man as being morally good or neutral, and that through force sharing should be accomplished. And so I not that I want to get too political here, although I have my own ideas, but
just
that's
if
one
I
of the
can
reasons why I wanted to have
follow up
you
on that.
Yeah, please.
So
please.
That's a good way of putting it, that for those of your listeners who are, I really like the U.S. Constitution, that kind of stuff, go look at what it does. When it talks about money, I think it's like Congress shall have the authority to, I think, coin and regulate. Maybe it says money, something like it. Certainly says coin money. And so people think, I think nowadays, oh yeah, so that's why they have the Federal Reserve and they can. And no, back when they wrote those words, I mean, to them, money was gold and silver, and so it had to do with the, ensuring fair weights and measures, like you were saying, the biblical principle of not defrauding the people that you're doing business with. And so the point of them coining the money was not that the government was allowed to just take a piece of paper and declare it to be money. It was to, stamp it so everybody could recognize, okay, yeah, this is an ounce of gold. That was the purpose.
Right. Great. Like I said, I have so many more questions, but they'll exist for another time. If you'll come back on, we'd love to have you back whenever. Let me just ooh and ah over you once again. Everyone should go out and get a book by Dr. Murphy. He's written on so many great things. His blog is amazing. He brings in economics, politics. He's got his own podcast. One thing that I really enjoy that I get a lot is whenever I see Dr. Murphy talk, his analogies that he pulls, and I don't know if it's from just your school of thought with Austrian economics and needing to have really good analogies, but I view your analogies in things when you're trying to explain a heavy concept, you'll not only be entertaining, but that you'll kind of hit it from 3 different angles and say, oh, if you didn't understand, this from this perspective, here's 2 more examples that I just think that you always hit out of the park. And you're not an economist who, like I said, has the ivory tower tweed and everything, that you really do speak non-Christianese, non-economic-ese to people like us on the lower level, trying to go through Wikipedia and looking up Austrian economics and not understanding it, but then picking up lessons for the young economists and not feeling bad that you're 35 years old picking up another textbook. So I greatly appreciate your work. I greatly appreciate who you are. I greatly appreciate your statements from your Christian point of view, and people should definitely check you out, and also look into your other podcast, especially for the infinite banking concept. And I'm sorry that we recently lost Nelson Nash, who was also an amazing Christian. Your interviews with him, I was smiling through. You did like an hour and a half with him, and I'm smiling that this kind of old timer knew this, great, awesome thing, and that he put it on paper, wrote a book, and that you and Carlos Nash came back and wrote books about it and teach other people about it. So I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for the kind words, Patrick. And yeah, as far as Nelson Nash, he was the guy who, again, not that I ever consciously said, oh, I'm not going to share my faith or whatever, but he was just so bold in quote, mixing his religion in with financial things that kind of gave me the courage and the push to say, I really need to not, keep my lamp under a bushel or whatever that phrase is, that to not be afraid. And I don't want to offend somebody by mentioning Jesus in this context. That no, people need to hear about him. So
yeah, absolutely. Is there any resources or people that you want to direct people to? I'll definitely have the links for your books and podcasts in the description. And is there just any general message to American, or not, to Christians in general, from a Christian and an economic person like yourself?
Read the Bible. I'm not sure if this is what you're asking, but yeah, I mean, I'm going to be debating someone at the Soho Forum on Christianity and economics and things like that. So if people want to follow my blog, to be sure to catch that, that might be something of interest. So yeah, consultingbyRPM.com is the central clearinghouse of all my stuff. So that's, if people want to learn more, that's where they should go.
Great. And again, thank you. And talking to Brad Pitt from my perspective here. So thank you. And we'd love to have you back anytime.
Thanks for having me, Patrick. It was
All
a
right.
pleasure.
Thank you.